When she got to the hospital on Monday morning, Gina Esposito found a note telling her to check in with her supervisor. A thrill of fear shot through her. The hospital had already had one round of layoffs, and the rumor mill said more were coming. But when she found her supervisor, she was relieved to learn that she wasn't being laid off. Her relief turned to dismay, however, when she heard she was being given a special assignment. Effective immediately, you've got a new patient to work with. He's a VIP and Dr. Adenauer is going to be treating him personally, so you'd better be on your toes. Gina tried not to roll her eyes as she took the file on her new patient. Just what I need. Wiping the butt of some senile old rich guy under the supervision of the chief medical officer, she thought disgustedly. But then she reminded herself that she was lucky to still have her job, and she chided herself for her attitude. She found herself doing that a lot. In fact, she thought, it's been happening ever since that rat ran out on me. Her then-boyfriend had managed to get her pregnant, even though she'd been on the pill. When he found out, he forgot his promise to marry her and promptly disappeared. Pregnant and unable to pay her rent by herself, Gina had had to move back in with her mother. Still, she reminded herself, if I hadn't gotten pregnant, I wouldn't have Angela now. The thought of her little girl cheered her up as it always did, and she marched off to her new assignment with her normally cheerful attitude firmly back in place. As she walked down the hallway, she went over her new patient's chart. Well, I was wrong about the Alzheimer's, she thought. Apparently her patient, Benjamin Mitchell, was a 36-year-old white male in otherwise good health who had had a sudden psychiatric crisis on Saturday night. She flipped through a series of pages. Wow, they put this poor guy through the ringer, she murmured. He had had a CAT scan, PET scan, MRI, and a complete physical exam. Everything had come back normal. Great, she thought. I wonder what I'm supposed to do with him? She found him in the rubber room. It wasn't really rubber, of course, mostly plastic-covered foam, but everybody at the hospital called it the rubber room. He must have thrown a doozy, she thought, peering at the comatose figure through the peephole. She turned to the night nurse who was preparing to go off duty. What's he been like? She asked. They took him down with diazepam during his psychotic episode, and they kept him on it while they were testing him. Once they finished, they brought him here, and he's been sleeping it off ever since. My guess is that they'll start him on clozapine once his system has cleared and then see what happens. Gina nodded. Who's on duty? Ed or Harold? The nurse knew what she meant immediately. Harold's on today, if you need him. Gina nodded again. Either one of the two big orderlies could handle the most violent patient, but Gina preferred Harold. He was a gentle giant. Ed always seemed to look for opportunities to inflict pain if a patient offered any resistance. She went back to the peephole and looked again. To her surprise, the patient was now sitting up, his back against the wall. He didn't appear agitated, so Gina decided to take a chance. Get Harold down here for me, she asked the other woman. I'm going to go see how our boy is doing in there. He doesn't look dangerous, but it's nice to know help is available. When she slipped the latch and opened the door, the patient looked up quickly, but otherwise didn't move. Nevertheless, Gina made sure to stay on the opposite side of the room. When she made no further move, he looked at her blankly. Who are you? I'm Nurse Esposito, she said, and you must be Mr. Mitchell. Is there anything I can do for you? She watched him carefully, curious to hear what would be his first priority. He surprised her. Yes, there is. Could you get me a cup of coffee? She thought about it momentarily, then decided a little caffeine couldn't hurt. She turned to the grill in the wall and said, Harold, could you get a cup of coffee for Mr. Mitchell? She turned back to look at Ben. Cream and sugar? Just sugar, 2 packs. When she handed him the cardboard cup, he quickly took a sip, then made a face. This is terrible, he said. She laughed. Tell me about it, she replied. I have to drink the stuff every day. He gave a little smile, and she thought to herself that that was a positive sign. She also noted that he didn't stop drinking the coffee. When he had finished the cup, he abruptly asked, So where am I? She had anticipated the question and decided to answer it directly. You're in Longview Psychiatric Hospital, Mr. Mitchell. You apparently suffered some kind of breakdown on Saturday night, and you were brought here for observation and treatment. He looked at her strangely. I remember being at a banquet, but after that I must have gone to sleep because I had terrible nightmares. At least I thought they were nightmares. He got a confused look on his face and suddenly asked, What day is it? It's Monday, she said quietly, waiting for his reaction. Monday, he exclaimed. Have I really been out of it that long? What is happening to me? Before Gina could reply, there was a noise from the door behind her, and in walked Dr. Bernard Adenauer, CEO and Chief Medical Officer of the Longview. The great man himself, she thought sarcastically. I'll answer that question, nurse, Dr. Adenauer, and Gina stepped hastily aside. The doctor walked over and gravely shook his patient's hand. Do you know me, Ben? Ben looked at him carefully and recognition dawned. I feel like I've met you before. Oh yeah, you're Dr. Adenauer. You're the head of Longview. The psychiatrist beamed at Ben like he was a bright boy in elementary school. Excellent, Ben. It appears your memory is unimpaired. That's a very good sign. Gina began making notes on her clipboard. Ben repeated his question. Dr. Adenauer, can you tell me what's wrong with me? Well, Ben, we are not ready to make a definitive diagnosis at this point, but we have learned quite a bit. In case you don't remember, you had a major psychotic episode at the banquet that, ironically enough, was being held in your honor. He gave a little chuckle. Apparently you frightened quite a lot of people with your behavior. Ben groaned and looked down in embarrassment. Gina snorted silently to herself. So much for patient sensitivity, she thought. Dr. Adenauer was unperturbed. When I heard of your episode and watched the video. Ben groaned again. They have it on video? Adenauer nodded and continued unabated. My immediate thought was that you were suffering from a glioma, a brain tumor. Pressure on your brain could explain such irrational behavior. Watching Ben turn pale, Gina decided that her initial assessment of Dr. Adenauer's bedside manner had been too kind. Fortunately, the good doctor continued. We have been able to rule that out as a possibility. Similarly, we have eliminated stroke, seizure, high blood sugar levels, and virtually every other physical abnormality that could have caused such an event. You'll be happy to know that you are a very healthy young man. Except that I'm losing my mind, Ben said bitterly. We're not ready to make that call just yet, Adenauer responded. You have had a single irregular event, nothing more. If it does not recur, we will conclude that it was a one-time occurrence of unknown origin. If it should recur, we will be in a position to evaluate what treatment might provide relief. Ben looked at him suspiciously. Do I have to stay here? Oh, yes, I think that would be wise. In the first place, your presence here will make it easier for me and others like Nurse Esposito to interact with and observe you. Secondly, should a recurrence of the original episode transpire, you will be in a safe place. Ben made a sour face. For how long? That we'll just have to see, the doctor said breezily. Well, I must go now, but I'll see you later to begin therapy. He turned to Gina. Nurse Esposito, would you come with me, please? Once they had left the rubber room, Dr. Adenauer turned and looked sharply at the nurse. Mr. Mitchell is a very important patient, Ms. Esposito. Your responsibility will be to devote full time to him. Full time? Gina gasped. What about my other patients? Adenauer frowned impatiently. Your other patients will be reassigned. You are to keep him company, interact with him, and generally make a continuous assessment of his state of mind. I want you to observe him carefully for any signs of a recurrence. Keep careful notes of his thoughts and actions, and especially look for any indications of irrationality. Document everything. Do you understand? I think so, doctor, but I've never done anything like this before and… Are you saying that you're incapable of performing these responsibilities, Nurse Esposito? Do you want me to find someone else to replace you? Oh, no, sir. I can do this, I assure you, she said hastily. That's good, he said. This appears to be a rather unusual case, and I want to be sure we observe and record the course of his disease very carefully. Yes, doctor, I understand. You can count on me. When the imposing figure of the chief medical officer had walked away, Gina rolled her eyes and shook her head. Holy smoke, what was that all about? I thought he was going to fire me on the spot. Taking a deep breath, she returned to the rubber room and let herself inside. Mitchell glared up at her. So, you're going to be my babysitter. In her notebook, Gina wrote, Patient displays initial hostility. Mentally, she groaned, this is not going to be a fun assignment. That night over dinner, Gina told her mother and brother about her new assignment. Her brother was a detective on the city police force. Ever since his marriage had broken up, Marco made it a habit of dropping by his mother's house for dinner once or twice a week. Gina accused him of being a mooch, but secretly she was delighted to have his company. She had always idolized her big brother growing up, and she enjoyed his company, even if he did like to tease her. She was bemoaning her new assignment when Marco interrupted her. What's your new patient's name? He asked. You know I'm not supposed to talk about our patients, she said. He rolled his eyes. It's not as though I'm going to broadcast his name on Twitter, he said with exasperation. Seeing that she wasn't going to talk, he went on. Okay, you said the guy freaked out at a banquet last weekend. Well, take a look at this. With that, he pulled out his iPad and connected to YouTube. In seconds, Gina and her mother were looking at video obviously taken from the floor of the hotel ballroom. There was Ben Mitchell stepping up to the podium to accept Banker of the Year honors and having a total meltdown in front of hundreds of guests. As Gina looked on in amazement, her mother grew very nervous. "Is it safe for you to be working with this man?" she asked apprehensively. Gina reassured her that she was perfectly safe. Nevertheless, she was taken aback at the way Ben had transformed so quickly from a normal, seemingly happy individual into a stark raving madman. "So what does the boss head shrinker say is the matter with this guy?" Marco asked irreverently. "Dr. Adenauer hasn't made a diagnosis yet," Gina said stiffly, bristling at her brother's teasing. "Well, I can tell you what's wrong with him, and I'm not even a rich doctor. Your boy's on drugs, for sure. I've seen it on the streets many times," Marco said confidently. Gina gave him a baleful look. "Well, you'd be wrong, smarty pants. In the first place, they did a full medical workup on him. He was clean, no drugs and not a drop of alcohol. In fact, they say he doesn't drink at all. Anyway, they checked his arms and legs carefully, no needle marks. And 200 people at the banquet ate the same food he did without any ill effects. So stick to your police work and leave the medical diagnoses to the professionals." Marco was undeterred. "Maybe so, but he sure looks drugged out to me." He shook his head. "Anyway, it's kind of a shame that it happened to him. From what I hear, he's a pretty good guy for a banker." Both women were curious now, so Marco went back to his iPad and found the video of Mitchell's loan to the thwarted bank robber. When they'd finished watching, Marco added, "I figured the guy was crazy when I heard about this little stunt. If somebody attempts to rob a bank, you can't just let him go. But apparently it worked this time. It just goes to show, there really is an exception for every rule." Gina said nothing, but she was impressed by the last video she'd seen. She decided to cut Ben Mitchell a little slack when she saw him the next day. Gina had never had an assignment like her current one, and she wasn't really sure what Adenauer wanted from her. How was a nurse supposed to find out anything about Ben's mental state? For that matter, how was she going to spend so much time with her patient without running out of things to talk about? And how was she going to achieve anything positive, given his depressed and somewhat antagonistic state of mind? The next morning, Gina strode into Ben's room with a sense of purpose. He greeted her with sarcasm. "Ah, my babysitter is back." Gina was undeterred. "That's not a very nice way to say hello, especially since I went to the trouble to be nice to you." With that, she revealed the cup of Starbucks she had brought with her and held it out to him. His demeanor changed completely, and he accepted the cup gratefully. His smile grew even broader when she handed him several packs of sugar. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "You don't know how much I've missed good coffee." After a couple of minutes, he looked up at Gina with a wry grin. "Okay, Nurse Esposito, I guess I owe you a little cooperation. So what's on the agenda for today? Word associations, Rorschach tests, block puzzles?" Gina rolled her eyes, but she had an agenda, so she ignored his jibes. After a lot of worrying, she had decided to start by exploring Ben's memories of what had happened immediately prior to his episode. She wanted to know in as much detail as possible everything that had happened before the onset of the attack, his emotions, his actions, and his interactions with others. As she posed her questions, everything he reported seemed completely normal and unremarkable to her. Nevertheless, she kept at it lest she overlook anything of importance. When she felt she had exhausted that subject, she gently pressed him to describe the episode itself. As she had anticipated, he was reluctant to do so, but she carefully explained that the details of his experience might prove helpful to Dr. Adenauer in diagnosing what had happened to Ben. As she listened to his account of his experience, Gina found it surprisingly difficult to maintain her professional demeanor. Most psychotics she had dealt with seemed unaware that anything unusual was happening to them. The voices they heard or the impulses they felt were integral to them. But Ben's experience was different. He seemed completely aware of how aberrant his behavior had been. Gina could easily see how fearful he was at the way his mind had misfired. The thing that seemed to disturb him most was the distortion of his perception. "I remember seeing a woman screaming, but instead of hearing her voice, I felt a strong, unpleasant taste in my mouth. At another point, I ran my hand over the nap of the carpet and saw the color blue. It was the most frightening and disconcerting experience I've ever had." "What you were experiencing is called synesthesia," Gina told him. "Basically, your senses became garbled and your brain interpreted sensations incorrectly. Synesthesia has been frequently observed, but exactly what's happening is not well understood." Ben was still upset by his memories of that experience, but he took a little comfort in the fact that there was a name for what had happened. It was clear to Gina that Ben didn't want to delve any further into his episode. She didn't want to risk triggering another one, so she suggested that they have an early lunch. As the two of them ate bland food off of paper plates, she racked her brain to think of a safer topic she could explore with him. As she pondered the problem, she remembered Dr. Adenauer's comment about Ben's memory. Maybe that was the approach she should use. Come to think about it, that might offer a way she could get Ben to accept her too. Okay, Gina said briskly when they'd finished lunch. Let's change the subject. This afternoon is all about Ben Mitchell. I want to know everything about you. Sounds to me like you're in for a pretty dull time, Ben said. You let me be the judge of that, she responded. Now let's get going. With that, she began to take him on a tour of his own life, asking him questions about every episode he could remember. His relationship with his parents, his likes and dislikes, emotions and preferences. In short, anything and everything that might possibly reveal some insight or precursor to his sudden psychosis. Before she'd started, she feared they might run out of things to discuss in short order. But once they started, time seemed to fly by, with each event eliciting yet more questions and more memories. Gina wasn't so interested in the actual events of Ben's life. Instead, she was looking for subtext, any insights that might reveal the mind of the patient before her. But it was impossible for her to hear his story and not become engaged by it. Gradually, she began to draw conclusions about the man, not just the patient. Before she started working with Ben, Gina had held certain stereotypes about businessmen in general and bankers in particular. But it quickly became clear to her that this one didn't fit her expectations. For example, he hadn't come from privilege. His father had been a mid-level manager, and she soon learned that Ben's mother had drunk any disposable income they might have had. As she listened to Ben talk about his mother, she quickly understood why he avoided alcohol so assiduously. Even if he had inherited any genetic predisposition to alcoholism, Gina decided, the spectacle of his mother's degeneration had clearly left a mark so indelible that he would never be tempted. But over and above the life lesson he had learned, Gina also observed the impact of his mother's disease on Ben. It would have been easier on him if she had died suddenly, she found herself thinking. Yet instead of withdrawal or bitterness, Ben's reaction had been to bond more closely with his father, and she decided that indicated a significant level of resilience, something she admired. Ben was just getting ready to talk about Elizabeth when they were interrupted by the midnight nurse. Sorry to barge in on you, Gina, but we won't be able to get the shift review and handover done if you don't stop. Gina was startled and, promising Ben they would get started promptly the next morning, she hurried off. Later, as she retrieved her car from the hospital parking garage and headed home, she shook her head. I've got to do a better job of managing my time, she thought ruefully. I've got a ton of notes to type up when I get home. The next morning, Gina arrived with another cup of Starbucks for Ben, and he acknowledged her thoughtfulness gratefully. She thought that he seemed glad to see her as well as her gift, and that encouraged her. Despite the amount of time she had spent with Ben going over the early years of his life, Gina's review of her notes had uncovered many more questions she wanted to explore. As a result, it wasn't until after lunch that they got back to the subject of Elizabeth. Gina had known that Ben had been previously married, but she hadn't known any details about their relationship or why it had ended. Despite her professional reserve, Ben's story touched her to an extent that surprised her. As a result, she was almost relieved when Ed came to escort Ben to his session with Dr. Adenauer. Once he'd gone, she'd blown her nose and wiped her eyes, chastising herself for becoming emotionally involved with one of her patients. The next morning, after Ben had had a chance to sip his coffee, he asked her an unexpected question. What do you think of Dr. Adenauer? Well, he's a noted psychiatrist and has done very well for himself, she said, not wanting to reveal her personal feelings about his aloof manner and dictatorial attitude towards the hospital staff. Why do you ask? It just seems like he was going through the motions with me, Ben complained. He seemed distracted and kept asking me questions that we'd already been over. Besides, I don't see how Freudian analysis is much use for a case like mine. I'm not a doctor, much less a psychiatrist, so I can't speak to Dr. Adenauer's methods, Gina equivocated. But he's very well respected, and I'm sure he knows what he's doing. Ben nodded and took another sip of his coffee, but it was obvious that he wasn't convinced by her answer. Then he startled her again. Before we talk about me anymore, I want to find out something about you. You've been asking all the questions so far, so it only seems fair to give me a turn, he said. No, that's not appropriate. You're the patient and I'm the caregiver. You're the person who's in treatment, not me. He winced visibly at her last remark, and Gina immediately felt guilty. There was an awkward moment of silence, but he recovered before she did. It's just that I'm not used to all this attention. Besides, I really would like to know a little something about you. After all, You've been virtually my only companion for quite a while now." She started to refuse him again, but then paused to consider. Maybe, she thought, I could learn something from the kind of questions he asks, the sort of things he's interested in. Besides, I don't know what the hell I'm doing in any case, so why not? She wound up spending most of the day telling her story to Ben. At first, his questions covered the sort of things a new acquaintance might ask, but soon he was probing for her thoughts and motivations even as he asked about dates and facts. Damn, she thought to herself, he's better at this than I am. He was particularly interested to learn about her relationship with her ex-boyfriend, and he was angered to hear how the man had deserted her when Gina had gotten pregnant. As she described the episode, Gina found long-suppressed emotions rising to the surface. "It wasn't as though I tried to get pregnant," she exclaimed angrily. "We used birth control, it just happened. But he accused me of trying to trap him into marriage, and then he just disappeared. Did you consider abortion or adoption?" Ben wanted to know. "Absolutely not," Gina snapped. "Angela's father may have been a rat, but my daughter is the best thing that ever happened in my life. It hasn't been easy trying to raise her on my own, but I wouldn't change anything that happened," she said forcefully. "I wish my mother had felt that way about me," Ben said wistfully. Just then there was a noise at the door to the room, and when Gina looked over her shoulder, she saw one of the most striking women she had ever seen step into the room. "Scylla," Ben called out and leapt to his feet. Immediately, a look of consternation came over the woman's face, and Gina realized instantly what was happening. She grabbed Ben's arm and tugged at it. "Sit down, Ben," she said urgently. "You'll startle her." Comprehension dawned on Ben's face, and he reluctantly sat back down. Seeing him acting in a non-threatening way, the woman re-entered the room. "Ben, darling, it's so wonderful to see you," she exclaimed. To Gina it sounded half-hearted, but she realized that people can respond that way to mental illness. Ben beamed at his wife. "It's so good to see you, babe. I've missed you so much." Scylla smiled and then glanced over at Gina. "Who is this woman?" she asked. Gina turned to face her. "I'm Nurse Esposito, Mrs. Mitchell. Dr. Adenauer assigned me to work with your husband on his recovery." Ben's wife gave her a perfunctory nod, then added, "I see. Well, I don't think we'll need you at this time." Gina was not to be cowed. "A staff member is required to be with a patient at all times on this floor," she said definitively. "They should have told you that at the desk." "It's all right," Ben spoke up quickly. "She's my friend. She's been helping me a lot." "I see," Scylla repeated. Apparently deciding not to make an issue of the situation, she turned back toward Ben. "Darling, I'm so sorry that I haven't been to visit you sooner. I knew you were in good hands, and things have been in such an uproar after your, unfortunate experience at the banquet. Anyway, I've been working closely with Perry to keeping everything going at the bank. It was really crazy for a while there, as you can imagine." Gina winced at her choice of words, but Scylla went right on. "In any case, Dr. Adenauer has been keeping me posted on your situation, and I'm very encouraged. He says you're making marvelous progress." Gina could see the skepticism in Ben's eyes at the mention of Dr. Adenauer, but she knew better than to say anything. As they talked, it was clear to Gina that Ben was delighted to see Scylla, but she also detected a hint of disappointment. "I'm really glad to know you and Perry are keeping things going at the bank," he told her. "That's a real comfort. Hopefully, I'll be able to get back in harness very soon." He paused and then added, "I do wish you could have visited sooner." "I know, darling, and I'm so sorry. But here, I have a little gift to make it up to you." With that, she lifted up the little brown bag she had brought with her and carried it over to her husband. When Ben opened it, he found a cup of Starbucks and 2 packs of sugar. "I know how much you must have missed your favorite coffee, so I brought you some." With that, she reached up to give him a quick kiss, and before he could react, she backed away hastily. "I'm sorry I have to dash now, darling, but it was wonderful to see you, and I'll be back as soon as I can." With that, Scylla turned and ducked out the door, leaving Ben holding the coffee and sugar with a bemused look on his face. Before the moment could grow awkward, Gina quickly spoke up. "Oh, that was so thoughtful of her to bring you your favorite coffee. She really must love you a great deal." Ben nodded and gave her a little smile, but Gina saw him glance over at the empty Starbucks cup she had brought for him that morning. Still trying to boost his spirits, she added, "Your wife is gorgeous. I can certainly see why you married her." "Thanks," Ben muttered, and sat down to drink his coffee. It was clear to Gina that he was disappointed by his wife's hasty departure. At that point, the midnight nurse stuck her head in the door, alerting Gina that it was time for the shift change. Gina patted Ben on the arm and said as cheerfully as she could, "I'll see you in the morning. Enjoy your coffee." As she drove home that night, Gina was fuming. What a witch, she thought. If Ben was my husband, I'd have been hammering on the hospital door every day to get in to see him, and then for her to disappear after 5 minutes. She was so incensed that she told her mother and Marco, who had dropped by for dinner, all about the situation. What is that woman's problem anyway? She fumed. Immediately Marco began to tease her about getting so close to her patients. When he began to sing-song about lovers kissing in a tree, Gina could take it no longer. Will you listen to yourself just once, Marco? You sound like you're back in high school. You don't know the first thing about the situation. This guy has been through a terrifying experience, and his wife treated him like crap. Anybody would be upset to see something like that, so just keep your opinions to yourself. Marco knew his sister well enough not to antagonize her further, but he couldn't keep the smirk off his face. Gina rolled her eyes and did her best to ignore him the rest of the evening. I am not getting too close to my patient, she told herself emphatically after he had left. Nevertheless, the next morning she found herself leaving early for work. After picking up a cup of Starbucks for Ben from the kiosk in the lobby of the hospital, she hurried to the ward. But before she entered, the night duty nurse stopped her. You better not go in there, she warned. He had another episode last night, and it was a real Lulu. Oh my God, Gina cried and rushed to look through the portal. Ben was enswathed in a straitjacket and propped up in the corner of the room. Clamping down on her emotions, she went back to the night nurse. Tell me what happened, she said in what she hoped was a calm voice. Apparently, it came on shortly after the evening shift change, she told Gina. The nurse on duty heard him cry out and observed that he was sweating profusely. Then he began raving and running about the room. The nurse said it was almost as though he was blind. He kept running into the walls and falling down. He'd blunder into a corner and crouch there like he was in fear. Then the next moment he'd be up and groping about with his hands outstretched. Anyway, luckily Harold hadn't left yet, and he and Ed managed to subdue the guy and get him into the jacket. We hit him with a high dose of diazepam and that quieted him down. But this morning he's been moaning and weeping again. Gina was distraught at this development, but she tried her best not to show it. She walked back to the portal and looked at Ben carefully. He seemed to be awake, but was totally passive. Gina opened the door and walked over to Ben's figure. Kneeling down, she began loosen the straitjacket. Are you sure you know what you're doing? The other nurse asked anxiously. He was pretty wild last night. I'm sure, Gina said, although in truth she wasn't sure at all what to expect. But she worked with determination until she finally had the heavy material off of him. Then she sat down beside him and put her arm around his shoulders. He looked over at her with frightened eyes. Oh, Gina, I don't know what's happening to me, he whispered in a hoarse voice. Then he put his head down in her lap and began to cry like a child. Most of Gina's patients hadn't known they were ill. On the contrary, most asserted forcefully that they were fine, but everyone else was crazy. For the first time, Gina was dealing with a patient who seemed to fully comprehend that something was going wrong in his brain, and that realization shook him to the core. Seeing him like this affected Gina more than any other patient she had cared for, and she found herself shedding her own tears to see him this way. She stayed with him for a long time until another nurse entered the room. When Gina raised her eyebrows in question, the nurse held up a hypodermic. Clozapine, she said, Dr. Adenauer's orders. Gina nodded. Clozapine was an atypical antipsychotic and the drug of choice in such cases. After Ben's second episode, it was obvious that he needed medication. Ben, she said quietly, the nurse is going to give you a shot to help you. He looked up at her a moment, then nodded apathetically. It broke her heart to see that all the spirit had gone out of him. After he was given the medication, Ben quickly slipped off to sleep. Gina left the room quietly, then paused outside to try to regain her composure. She was deeply distressed that Ben had had a second episode. He'd seemed to be doing so well, acting so normally that she dared to hope that what had happened to him at the banquet was some sort of one-off. Then she remembered Scylla's remark about Dr. Adenauer's assessment of Ben's progress. I'd like to hear what Adenauer says now, she thought angrily. She stepped over to the computer terminal and quickly called up Ben's records so she could see for herself. What she found shocked her. Dr. Adenauer had written that patient appears to be suffering from acute/transient psychotic disorder. Underneath that entry she found a second, dated last night, changing the diagnosis to persistent delusional disorder with chronic primary hallucinatory psychosis. She had to look that up in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and when she found it she was deeply distressed. The current research indicated that even the best pharmacological agents available could not eradicate psychotic delusions, only attenuate them. Adenauer must have been feeding Scylla Mitchell a line of bull to keep her from worrying. Gina decided. Still, it wasn't her responsibility to enlighten the woman. That thought made her check the logs, and she found no evidence that anyone had called Ben's wife with an update. That too wasn't her responsibility, but Gina decided to do so anyway. She felt that Ben needed something to keep his spirits up, and it was clear that he wanted to see more of his wife. Maybe she'd come if she knew what had happened. Hoping she wasn't going to get in trouble, Gina picked up the phone and dialed the number shown in Ben's emergency contacts. When her call was answered, Gina immediately recognized the woman's contralto voice. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Nurse Esposito from the hospital. I don't want to alarm you, but last night your husband suffered a second major psychotic episode. I thought you would want to know." "Oh, how dreadful," the voice exclaimed. "How is he now?" "We had to sedate him overnight, Mrs. Mitchell, but he woke up this morning and seemed relatively normal. Dr. Adenauer prescribed some additional medication and he's sleeping now. I'd guess he'll be awake around noon if you'd like to come and see him. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it to the hospital today, but I'll come to see him as soon as my schedule permits," Scylla said smoothly. Gina tried not to explode at the woman's attitude. "Mrs. Mitchell, I really think it would help your husband's state of mind if he could see you as soon as possible," she said. Now the woman's tone was icy. "I'll come to see him as soon as my schedule permits. Thank you for calling." And with that she disconnected the call. Gina stood there fuming. "What kind of wife is she?" she asked angrily. She was still angry when she got home that evening, and after dinner she called her brother who, for a change, hadn't come over for a meal. "Hey, Marco, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to run a background check on Mrs. Benjamin Mitchell. She goes by the name Scylla." Whoa, sis, I can't just run a check on somebody without a good reason," Marco protested. "Well, I've got a good reason," Gina said hotly, and proceeded to describe her 2 run-ins with her patient's wife. "She may be a cold-hearted witch, but that still doesn't mean I can run a check on her," Marco said after Gina had finished. "Listen, I know you checked up on your ex without anyone finding out. Just do the same thing on her, and let me know what you find out. You're going to get me in trouble one of these days, Gina, but I'll see what I can do." Gina hadn't heard anything further from her brother by the time she went back to work 2 days later. She checked the patient log and was unsurprised to find that Ben had had no visitors during that time. When she went in to see him, she found him calm but listless. "I feel like my brain is filled with molasses," he complained. "All my thoughts seem to be in slow motion." She nodded reassuringly. "That's a known side effect of the clozapine," she told him. "It tends to go away pretty quickly once the medication is discontinued." "When will that be?" he asked hopefully. Gina realized she had blundered, but she tried to cover her mistake. "That will be up to Dr. Adenauer to decide," she said. She expected him to protest, but he seemed to lose interest. "It doesn't really matter anyway," he said morosely. "I don't want to be able to think if I'm going to keep freaking out." Having Ben fall into depression was the last thing Gina wanted now. Desperately she cast about, trying to think of some subject they could discuss that would be neutral, but still hold Ben's attention. Suddenly it came to her. "Tell me about banking," she said abruptly. "I know you got into it because your father was a banker, but there must be something more that's kept you there." He looked at her suspiciously. "What do you care about banking?" She was committed now. "It's not that I'm so interested in banking. I just want to know why you're so interested." He shrugged his shoulders in resignation and began to tell her the story about the Christmas Day excursion with his father so long ago. At first, he simply recounted the event and the conversation in a neutral tone of voice. But as he got into it, Gina could see his passion building. She asked him for clarification and heard a note of enthusiasm. As he went on, Gina was delighted. Not only was he coming out of his depression, but his speech patterns and thought processes seemed to sharpen in the process. At the same time, to her surprise, she found herself being caught up in his story. Who knew that such a boring vocation could have so much impact on people's lives? Their conversation continued on through lunch and into the afternoon. Gina was just about to ask Ben a question when there was a commotion at the door. In walked Scylla Mitchell, accompanied by a man in a business suit. Gina had already formed her opinion of Ben's wife, and she was not much more impressed by her companion. The man was about Ben's age, but he was overweight and his hair was thinning. Who is he, and why is Scylla Mitchell with him? She wondered. Ben stood up as though to rush over to Scylla, but, perhaps remembering Gina's prior caution, held himself back. "Babe, it's so good to see you," he enthused. Then he turned to the man beside her. "Perry, thanks for coming. How are you?" he said excitedly. "Gina, this is my business partner, Perry Bergen." Eagerly, he began to quiz the man about the bank, but Scylla interrupted him. "That can wait till later, darling," she said. "There's something else that we need to discuss with you." As you can imagine, All sorts of issues have been piling up at CFB that need executive action. We've deferred those as long as we could, hoping you'd be able to resume your duties as CEO. But now with this latest setback, it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. Gina wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but one look at Ben's face told her he wasn't happy about it. Perry picked up the topic. That's right, Ben. There's a ton of things we've got to get done. We've got filings to make to the Securities and Exchange Commission, contracts to be signed, that offer from bank group that we haven't dealt with yet. Wait a minute, Ben burst in. We already agreed that we were going to turn down the bank group offer. Of course, Perry hurried on. But we haven't done that formally, and they're waiting to hear from the CEO on it. What Perry is trying to say is that the bank was floundering without a CEO at the helm, Scylla said. So he has stepped in to take over that role, just until you're well, of course. And to make sure our interests are covered, he asked me to serve as executive vice president. Perry was stunned. But how can he do that? I'm the CEO and the largest shareholder. You can't just push me aside. Of course not, darling. No one's pushing you aside. We've just gotten Judge Gray to grant me power of attorney for your affairs, darling, just until you're well again. It was the only way we could keep things running smoothly while you're in here and, fighting your illness. You had me declared incompetent? Ben asked in disbelief. Believe me, it was the only way, darling, Scylla said smoothly. Besides, it's only until you recover. Then everything will be back the way it was before. To Gina's eyes, it looked as though someone had let all the air out of Ben. He seemed to shrink into himself, and he slumped back against the wall behind him. If it's the only way, I understand. It's just a little hard to take, Gina wanted to rush to him and console him in his obvious distress, but then from the corner of her eye she spotted the second shift nurse signaling to her. Reluctantly she said, Ben, I have to go now. I'll see you in the morning, okay? Sure, he said listlessly. Perry spoke up. I think we should go too, Scylla. We don't want to interfere with the operation of the hospital. As Gina finished putting her notes together for the shift, she watched the two of them go out, talking earnestly with each other in low voices. She ground her teeth in anger. Even if what they had done had been necessary, surely there was a better way they could have presented it, she thought. When she was done, she made her way to the stairs leading to the parking garage. As she walked through the shadows, she suddenly heard voices arguing, and she stopped stock still. The hospital was in a safe neighborhood, and she'd never had any trouble before. But Gina knew that a woman alone always needs to be ultra careful. Not here, she heard a woman's voice hiss, and she immediately recognized Scylla. Intrigued, Gina slipped closer, trying to see what was going on. Come on, Scylla. It's done now. Ben's out of the picture, and we're in control. There's no need for hiding any longer. Oh crap, that's Perry Bergen's voice, Gina thought. What the hell is going on? Perry, it won't do us any good if anyone finds out before all this is over. Now if you'll just control yourself long enough to drive home, I'll show you why patience is a virtue. Gina couldn't hear the man's response because the engine of his car suddenly roared to life. Then, as she crouched behind a pillar, the car sped off down the ramp to the street. Oh my God, Gina thought as she headed home. Are Scylla and Perry having an affair? That which, I wouldn't put anything past her. She found her brother helping their mother fix dinner, and Gina pounced on him. Quick, tell me, did you get anything on Scylla Mitchell? She demanded. Marco got a sly look on his face. Gina, I did look into Scylla Mitchell, and I have to thank you for asking. Why? What did you find out? His sly look had turned into a broad grin. I found out she's the hottest looking woman I've seen in a long time, he chortled. It was definitely a pleasure checking her out. Gina was not amused. Fesso, she yelled at him angrily. I want to know what she's really like. I think she's having an affair with Ben's partner, and the two of them are up to no good. Marco's smile was replaced by a knowing look. Well, that would fit the pattern. What do you mean? Gina demanded. According to the information I got, she was married to a guy in Miami like she told Ben. And here's a coincidence. He was a banker too. But she didn't leave him because he was abusive. In fact, he was the one who gave her the heave-ho when he caught her cheating on him. He also gave her the back of his hand, which is how she got that busted nose. Didn't she take him to court for that? Gina wanted to know. I'm afraid our gal was pretty naive back in those days. She didn't know that her hubby was the banker to some pretty rough characters in the import business, if you know what I mean. Apparently some of those guys paid her a little visit and explained that if she wanted to keep the rest of her face intact, she'd better accept her hubby's offer and get the hell out of town. They must have made themselves clear, because my contacts at Miami PD said she was on a plane out of there the next day. I guess she must have used the settlement she got from him to go to Wharton, Gina said, remembering what Ben had said. Her brother chuckled. Maybe her flight from Miami connected through Philadelphia International Airport, but that's as close as she ever got to you, Pin. She attended Florida Atlantic for a couple of years when she was younger, and that's it for her formal education. That witch, Gina growled. She's been playing Ben for a fool the entire time. I can't wait to tell him what she's up to now. Slow down, sis, Marco said. It's not a crime to tell a few white lies to make yourself look better to a potential husband. If it were, we'd have to arrest half the people on Match.com. And as for cheating, what proof do you have? Yeah, what you heard in the parking garage sure sounds suspicious, but there could be another explanation. Besides, your patient's already clinging to his sanity by his fingernails. Are you sure you want to loosen his grip any further? You need to go slow, girl. Gina took a deep breath. I guess you're right, she said reluctantly, but I'm going to watch that woman like a hawk. She bothered me from the first minute I saw her, and everything you've told me makes me just that much more suspicious of her. Marco grinned slyly at her. You're just jealous that she found Ben before you did. I am not. He's just a nice guy who needs help, and he's sure not getting it from his wife. Sure, Gina, sure, he said, still grinning. The next morning, Gina still wasn't certain what to say to Ben. The conversation she'd overheard was certainly provocative, but she had to admit that it was less than definitive. And Ben is so fragile right now, she thought. Just as she finished the handoff from the third shift nurse, her cell phone went off, and when she pulled it out of her pocket, she saw that it was her brother calling. I'm warning you, Marco. I don't want to hear any more of your teasing this morning. This is no joke, Gina. We just got word that Perry Bergen was found dead in his home of an apparent heart attack. I thought you ought to know. Oh my God, Marco, that's terrible. I guess I've got to tell Ben, but it's going to be really hard on him. Perry was his best friend. Still, I don't want him to find out some other way. Damn. When she went into the rubber room, Ben was sitting quietly on the floor. He looked up to see her, and a brief smile crossed his face, but then he seemed to slip back into apathy. It's the drugs, Gina thought, hating that they had that effect. She came and sat down beside, taking his hand in hers. Ben, I have some bad news to tell you. When she had finished, he began to moan. I can't believe Perry is gone. He was here in this room only yesterday. Why? He moaned again, and Gina realized that he was perspiring heavily. She looked at his face anxiously and saw that his eyes were unfocused. No, he yelled suddenly. Make it stand still. Then he began babbling, his face contorted by fear. The desk nurse must have heard him because her voice came over the intercom. Are you okay, Gina? Do you need me to get Ed? Not yet, Gina yelled back, half pleading. Let me stay with him a little longer and see if it helps. Okay, Gina. But don't take any chances, came the disembodied voice. Ben was writhing on the padded floor. Gina scooted closer to him. It's all right, Ben. I'm right here. Nothing's going to hurt you. He continued to make unrecognizable sounds, but they didn't seem as frenzied to Gina as they had a moment ago. She reached over and rubbed his back with her hand. He flinched, but he didn't try to get away. Encouraged, she continued to rub his back, murmuring soothing words to him. He shifted around blindly, his head bumping into her thigh. He lifted up slightly and then let his head fall into her lap. She held his head with her left hand and rubbed his back with her right, crooning to him like a mother comforting a frightened child. Gina was so focused on trying to calm him that she lost track of time. Eventually, she realized that he had fallen asleep. Gently, she eased herself out from under him and pulled a foam pillow under his head. Then she walked quietly to the door and let herself out, locking it behind her. Are you all right? The desk nurse asked anxiously. Did he hurt you? No. Why would you think that? The woman pointed silently at her face. Gina walked hastily to the ladies' room and looked in the mirror. Only then did she realize that her makeup was streaked with tears. She kept watch over Ben for the next few hours, but he continued to sleep. Finally, late that afternoon he began to stir, and when Gina noticed, she hurried back inside. Ben raised his head groggily and looked at her uncomprehendingly for a moment. Then something clicked and a look of despair came over him. It happened again, didn't it? One moment we were talking and the next everything started to go crazy. I saw your face melting and there was a weird taste in my mouth. I tried to warn you, but all that came out of my mouth were colors. He looked at her helplessly. I really am insane, aren't I? Gina grabbed his hand and squeezed it to emphasize what she wanted to say. Ben, don't you see, this time was different. Yes, you had another episode, but it only lasted a short while. And you came out of it on your own. We didn't have to knock you out or strap you down. I don't know what's going on clinically, but I have to believe this is a sign of improvement. It didn't feel like improvement to me, Ben said bitterly. My brain stopped working right just the way it did before. Then he paused and seemed to think about his experience. But it didn't seem as bad as last time, and I wasn't as frightened. It was still scary, but somehow I felt like I could get through it okay. Gina didn't say anything, but inside she was glowing. This episode was much milder than the two others he'd experienced, and the fact that he'd been able to throw off the effects by himself seemed highly encouraging to her. And, if she were honest with herself, she felt gratified that she'd been able to help him get through it. Scylla couldn't have done that, a little voice whispered, but she brushed it aside. When her shift was over, Gina stayed later to look over Ben's records again. The fact that his experience this time was so different seemed significant to her, but what that might suggest she had no idea. She reread his entire file, looking for any clue. In particular, she went over his blood work again, hoping to find some imbalance or deficiency that might offer an explanation. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and at last she gave up and left. When she got home that evening, she was surprised to find Marco waiting. "What's the matter, big brother? Did the deli quit serving free food to cops?" she asked with a smile. This time, however, Marco wasn't in a joking mood. "I came over because I wanted to hear what happened with your patient today." Gina's smile evaporated as she told him about her patient's latest episode. "But I helped him, Marco. I was able to calm him down, and he came out of it much sooner than the last 2 times. I think that's a good sign." Marco looked at her appraisingly. "Sis, I know I'm not a doc, but I have to tell you your patient is taking LSD. Look, everything fits. The sudden onset, the wild hallucinations. I tell you he's had a couple of bad trips, but they're not all the same," Gina protested. "His episode today was very different from the previous 2. Did you tell him about Bergen?" Marco asked. "Yes," Gina said hesitantly. "Well, there you have it. He had a flashback brought on by stress. It's a pretty common phenomenon. Marco, I'm telling you he's not on LSD. They did all kinds of tests on him when he had his first episode. They didn't find anything." "Okay, so what kind of drug testing did they do?" he wanted to know. "A urinalysis, of course. That's what the federal government mandates. They found nothing." Marco nodded. "And how long after he went bananas did they test him?" he wanted to know. Gina thought back, trying to recall the records she had just been reviewing. Well, the onset of his first episode was around 9 p.m. on a Saturday. They kept him in the rubber room until Sunday, when they could get him to General Hospital for testing. Then they did all sorts of imaging on him. If I remember correctly, it wasn't until after they got him back to Longview that they did the blood work and urinalysis. So it could have been 24 hours or more, Marco said knowingly. "So what?" Gina shot back. "A urinalysis can detect drug usage up to several days after use. Not LSD, Marco said. That stuff can clear the urinary tract in as little as a couple of hours." When he saw Gina start to protest, he held up his hand. "Listen, I know you're the medical expert, but I'm the expert when it comes to drug testing. So how long after his second episode did they wait to run the tests again?" "They didn't. There was no need. He was in the hospital. Everything he ingested came from there. There was no way he could get drugs." "You're absolutely sure he didn't ingest anything from outside the hospital?" "Well, I did bring him a cup of coffee from the Starbucks stand in the hospital lobby, but I promise you I didn't drug him." Marco didn't even grin at that. "I don't even have to ask about the banquet. There was so much eating and drinking going on that drugging him would have been easy to do. But the hospital episode is a stumper. You're sure nobody else brought anything in?" "Nobody but Scylla Mitchell. She brought him a cup of Starbucks too. But if someone had laced the coffee with LSD, half the hospital would have freaked out." At Scylla's name, Marco perked up. "Does he take anything with his coffee? Sugar? Cream? One of those fancy toppings?" "Just sugar." "Then that's it," he said with certainty. "It was in the sugar packets. It would have been easy to pick up a couple of packets and doctor them at her leisure." He saw Gina start to protest, and he went on quickly. "Come on, Gina. You're a nurse. You know how fine hypodermic needles are. And don't forget, LSD is odorless, colorless, and tasteless. Somebody could inject a drop or 2 into a sugar packet, and the user would never know anything was wrong until the walls started melting." "Then we've got to do something," she said urgently. "Whoa, don't go off half-cocked there. All this is just you and me speculating about what might have happened. On the other side, we've got a well-respected psychiatrist who says I'm dead wrong about what happened to Ben. And even if Ben's wife was messing with her husband's mind so she could pursue an affair with his partner, how could you prove it? That guy is now a body in the morgue. At this point, all you can do is keep looking. Gina shook her head. I guess you're right, but I don't like it one bit. Marco gave her a sharp look. Just one thing, baby sister. Keep your eyes open in that loony bin. Know what I mean? She nodded unhappily. When Gina went to work the next day, she again found herself in a quandary about what to say to Ben. She felt it would be a mistake to bring up her suspicions for fear of upsetting him again. She'd already seen firsthand what the news of Perry Bergen's death had done to him, and she didn't want to bring on another episode. Nor did she want to ask any questions about Scylla. As far as she knew, Ben had no doubts about his wife. For Gina to make accusations would risk alienating him. Eventually, she decided to keep their conversations low-key and as normal as possible. Nevertheless, her brother's words stayed with her, and she felt uneasy and unable to relax. 2 days later, something happened that really set off her paranoia. In mid-afternoon, the desk nurse flagged Gina down and told her that she was to take Ben up to Dr. Adenauer's office on the 6th floor. That order was so unprecedented that Gina had to ask the nurse to repeat it. Neither of them could ever remember a patient being taken to the executive level, and that set off alarm bells in Gina's head. To stall for time, Gina asked the nurse to round up a wheelchair for Ben, while she went to the ladies' room to make herself presentable. Once in the restroom, Gina grabbed her cell phone and called her brother. Marco, something's happening here that really upsets me, she told him. You need to get over here, Stat. When she explained the strange order she'd received, Marco's voice took on a skeptical tone. What's so weird about that? She tried to explain how out of the ordinary this was and how uncomfortable it made her. Patients never go to the 6th floor, never. I don't know what's going on, but after everything that's happened, I feel very uneasy about this, Marco. Something about it just doesn't feel right. No, something about it feels very wrong. Please, Marco, please. She could almost see him shaking his head. Gina, I can't just bust into the chief medical officer's suite and demand an explanation. A stunt like that could get me fired. And anyway, I'm really covered up with work here. I'm sorry, sis, but I just can't get away. I'm scared, Marco, she said, but he'd already hung up. She put the phone back in her pocket and looked at her face in the mirror. Come on, Gina. It's probably nothing. Besides, whatever happens, you've got to be strong for Ben. You don't want to scare him into another attack. When she came out, she had calmed herself a little. The desk nurse had found a wheelchair, so Gina took it and opened the door to the rubber room. Then she went in to explain their excursion to Ben as best she could. He was curious about the visit to Dr. Adenauer's office, but taken aback at the sight of the wheelchair. It's hospital policy, Ben, Gina reassured him. This way you can't fall and sue Longview for negligence. We wouldn't want you to have an accident. Ben grudgingly complied. When the elevator stopped on 6, Gina wheeled him out. This was the first time she'd been on the executive floor, and she looked around with interest at the furnishings. Unlike the terrazzo on the floors where she worked, this floor had thick carpeting that made it somewhat difficult to push the wheelchair. They sure aren't expecting patients up here, she thought apprehensively. When she neared the end of the hallway, she was startled to see Ed open the double doors to Dr. Adenauer's office suite. Ed, what are you doing here? She asked nervously. The way the big orderly looked at her always made her uncomfortable. I'm just here to make sure there are no disturbances, he said with a grin as he stepped back to let her enter. At first, Gina saw no one else present, but then she spotted Dr. Adenauer talking with Scylla Mitchell out on what appeared to be a large balcony. Come in, Ben, Adenauer said jovially. I'm so glad you could join us today. Bring him over here, nurse, so we can all sit out here and enjoy the afternoon sunshine. At Adenauer's beckoning, Gina wheeled Ben across the marble floor to the balcony. As Ben stood up, his wife came over and gave him a quick hug. To Gina's eyes, Scylla's action showed a distinct lack of affection, but she kept her opinion to herself. Ben, Scylla, and Dr. Adenauer seated themselves around the small table on the balcony, and Ed took up a position beside the entrance, leaving Gina standing there uncertainly. This is a bit of a celebration, the doctor said grandly, so I think refreshments are in order. No alcohol for me, Ben said quickly. No, of course not, Adenauer said. I know your preference, Ben. We have coffee for you, and tea for Scylla and me. He turned to Gina. Everything is in the kitchen. Would you bring it out for us, nurse? Gina bristled at being treated like a waitress. People had done that to her before, and she'd quickly set them straight. But under these circumstances, she held her tongue and went off in the direction the doctor had indicated. As she walked into the little kitchenette, she was confused about what was happening. What did they have to celebrate? She wondered. The whole thing seemed bizarre. Looking around, she spotted the cups and saucers set out on a silver tray. A pot of hot water was keeping warm on the stove, and next to it there was an expensive coffee maker with a full pot already brewed. As she poured the water into the cups with the tea bags and the coffee into the remaining cup, she noticed that packets of sugar had already been laid out on each saucer. She was about to take the tray out to the balcony when a terrible thought struck her. What if the sugar had been tampered with? The thought sent a chill through her, but before she could think what to do, she heard Dr. Adenauer calling impatiently for her. When Gina set the tray down on the table, Scylla quickly reached across and distributed the cups and saucers in their proper positions. Dr. Adenauer nodded approvingly, then looked up at Gina. "Thank you, nurse. That will be all. You may return to your ward." Leaving Ben alone with these people was the last thing Gina wanted to do. "Shouldn't I stay to help Ben?" she asked desperately. Adenauer's countenance hardened, and in a peremptory voice he said, "We'll take good care of your patient. Now go, and close the door behind you when you leave." Gina turned and reluctantly made her way to the door, desperately trying to think of something she could do to help Ben. Failing that, she went out, pulling the doors to behind her. Ben had been watching, and it was clear that he was growing uncomfortable. "I don't understand, Dr. Adenauer. Why am I here? What's going on?" "We'll explain everything in just a minute," Scylla offered. "But first, let's just enjoy our beverages and this beautiful fall sunshine." As the three of them sipped their drinks, Adenauer used the opportunity to describe his vision for Longview Hospital and to boast about some of its achievements. When he had finished, Ben looked at him curiously. "That's all very impressive, Dr. Adenauer, but I don't see how that affects Scylla and me." Scylla and the doctor exchanged a quick glance before Adenauer turned back to Ben. "The fact of the matter is that there are always challenges to any great vision, and there are always those unable or unwilling to see the opportunity. In the case of Longview, for instance." "What Dr. Adenauer is trying to say," Scylla interrupted, "is that he is a much better psychiatrist than he is a business manager." Adenauer gave her an indignant look, but she pressed on. "I'm afraid the good doctor's grand vision has fallen on hard times financially. The hospital is experiencing a short-term but extremely serious cash flow problem. To make matters worse, the other lending institutions around here have all seen fit to deny the hospital the loans that would maintain its solvency. In short, if someone doesn't extend him some serious credit very soon, his hospital is going to go belly up." "Now I think that's exaggerating the situation," Adenauer said, but Scylla ignored him. "Community First Bank could have met the hospital's needs, but of course it doesn't make those kinds of loans," Scylla went on. Ben shook his head emphatically. "That's right. We serve a completely different customer. We'd never make an institutional loan like that." "That's true," Scylla said, "unless there were a change of management at CFB, one that brought in a new philosophy. But that could never happen unless the old leadership was somehow incapacitated, forcing a replacement." "What are you saying, Scylla?" Ben asked in shock. "Scylla, I'm not at all comfortable with this discussion," Adenauer said. Scylla ignored them both. Looking at Ben, she continued, "Once Dr. Adenauer helped me get you declared incompetent. It was a simple matter to manipulate poor love-struck Perry Bergen into doing what I wanted. Regrettably, Perry got impatient and wouldn't listen to reason, so it became necessary for me to get rid of him as well." "Scylla, we didn't discuss this at all," Adenauer said anxiously. "This is making me very nervous." Before he could say anything more, Ben leapt to his feet. "My God, Scylla, I can't believe this. You did this to me? You murdered Perry? Who are you?" She gave him a cold, hard smile. "I'm a woman who knows what she wants and how to get it. And what I want now is for Bank Group to acquire CFB and make me very wealthy. Unfortunately, our negotiations have hit a snag. Bank Group is concerned that the power of attorney I hold could be reversed and the deal could fall through. To resolve this issue, Dr. Adenauer and I have to make sure that you never regain your faculties." Ben felt a cold sweat come over him as he registered the implications of Scylla's words. "What are you planning now?" he asked anxiously. "I'm afraid you're going to have another episode, Ben, a major one. In your delusional state, you're going to leap over the balcony railing and fall to your death." "You can't do that." Ben gasped with alarm. "Actually, I already have," she said coolly. "The sugar in that coffee you just drank was laced with LSD, which should be taking effect any minute now. Look at you. You're already beginning to sweat like a pig. Soon you'll be totally helpless. Then our large friend Ed here is going to help you try to learn how to fly." Ben felt Ed's heavy hands pressing him back down into his seat. "No, let me go," Ben shouted, and then began to struggle while yelling for help at the top of his lungs. Even as he did so, he felt another attack coming on. Suddenly the door to the suite flew open and Gina rushed in. "What are you doing to him?" she cried out. "You let him go." Adenauer was panic-stricken at Gina's sudden appearance, but Scylla remained cool. Well, isn't this touching? Our little nurse is trying to save her patient. I wondered if you might have lost some of your professional detachment over my husband, and now I see that I was right. She heard what you said, Adenauer yelled hysterically. What do we do now? Actually, I think this is perfect, Scylla said calmly. It will make a great story. Caring nurse tries to save her patient only to be pulled to her death by the psycho. All those detailed notes you've been keeping will document how devoted you were to him, as well as how demented he could become. We'll make a martyr of you, my dear. At that moment, Adenauer gave a loud, incoherent shriek, causing everyone in the room to turn and gape at him. No, get away from me. Make it stop, he shouted. His arms flailed wildly as he leapt to his feet, and his head swiveled right and left repeatedly, staring at something none of the others could see. Keep away from me. Don't touch me, he screamed in terror. Then, as the rest of them watched in astonishment, the doctor suddenly lurched backwards, climbed up on the railing and toppled over the balcony with a wail. I'm sorry. I didn't know that would happen, Gina said piteously. The rest of them turned to her in surprise. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want Ben to use that sugar, so I switched it with Dr. Adenauer's, she said. Ben began moaning as he felt the onset of the flashback, and then he slumped helplessly in his chair. Ed gave a snarl at Gina, pulled a knife out of his pocket, and started toward the frightened nurse. When she saw him coming, she screamed, "Don't you touch her!" A voice yelled out from behind her, and Marco ran into the room, his pistol drawn. The big man saw him and changed direction to attack this new intruder. Marco fired, but the bullet seemed to have no effect. He fired again and then a third time. A look of surprise came over Ed's face, and he looked down in wonder at the red blood pulsing out of his white jacket. Then he took a step backward, tripped over the wheelchair, and tumbled to the floor. He moaned once and then lay still. Scylla was the first to recover, and she quickly began to slide toward the door. But Gina saw her and grabbed her arm. "You're not getting away," she snarled. Seeing there was no escape, Scylla stood up and straightened her clothing. "Officer, I want you to arrest that woman," she said, pointing at Gina. "You heard her admit that she drugged poor Dr. Adenauer." "That's a lie," Gina gasped. "She was the one who was trying to drug Ben. And that man," she said, pointing at Ed's body, "was trying to kill me." "Nonsense," Scylla spoke up quickly. Ed was an employee of the hospital who was trying to protect Dr. Adenauer from what he thought was an attack by intruders. And that man over there, who is obviously mentally disturbed, is my husband, who was being treated by Dr. Adenauer. Gina calmly crossed her arms and stared coldly at the woman she had come to hate. "Oh, is that so?" she asked. "We'll just see about that." With that, she darted into the kitchenette and came back out a moment later holding her cell phone. "I left this in there when you tried to send me away, and it's been recording everything that was said. I wonder what a jury will think of that, Scylla." The attractive woman stood there in silence, staring at her antagonist balefully. As Marco went over to cuff Scylla, Gina rushed over to Ben, who was still sitting slumped in the chair. As she reached his side, he lifted his head and gave her a bewildered look. "What happened?" he asked weakly. "I think the stress pushed you into another flashback," Gina said gently. Recognition flashed in Ben's eyes, and he sat upright. "Oh my God, I remember. Scylla killed Perry, and she was going to have me killed as well. She's the one who's been feeding me the drugs." He stared at Gina, expecting to see his own shock mirrored in her expression. But what he saw was a happy smile, and his face showed his confusion. "Ben, listen to yourself," she said excitedly. "You shook off the flashback. You were out of it only a few minutes, and now you're back to normal. You really are getting better." With that, she threw her arms around him, and he returned the embrace in happy relief. When Gina got home from work 2 weeks later, she was delighted to see her big brother there. She hugged him soundly. "My hero," she said. Enough, he said, although it was clear that he enjoyed her continuing gratitude. "It'll never be enough," she said fervently. "If you hadn't showed up when you did, I might be a red spot on the hospital parking lot now." He shuddered and turned serious. "I heard you, you know. On the phone I heard you say you were scared just as I hung up. I just couldn't desert my little sister." She hugged him again, tears of gratitude in her eyes. After dinner, Gina encouraged her daughter to go up to her room to play because she wanted to get an update from her brother on the case, and she didn't want her 5-year-old to hear the conversation. Once Angela had left, Marco gave Gina and her mother the latest news. He told them that Scylla had been indicted by the grand jury, but she's hired some big-shot lawyer and pleaded not guilty. How can she do that? Gina demanded indignantly. I have a recording of her laying out the whole plot in Adenauer's office. There's no way she can talk her way out of that. Marco shrugged his shoulders. Her attorney is trying to argue that that whole thing was a privileged conversation between doctor and patient. I never heard of anything like that being privileged, but even if it is, we've got a ton of other evidence against her, and we're digging up more all the time. I don't think there's any way she'll wiggle off this hook. Marco shook his head with a wry smile. You know, I could almost feel sorry for Scylla. If she wasn't a homicidal psychopath. She was quite the schemer, but very scheme she hatched kept running into obstacles. She married Ben because she thought he would be her ticket to luxury, but she became frustrated when Ben refused Bankgroup's acquisition offer. So Scylla decided to get Ben declared insane with Dr. Adenauer's help, and she seduced Perry Bergen to get him to agree to Bankgroup's offer once Ben was out of the way. She figured Bergen would be easier to manipulate than Ben had proved to be. So Bergen was in on the whole thing? Gina asked. All of it except Ben's murder, Marco replied. Bergen's wife told us that Bergen had always been jealous of Ben, and all the public acclaim Ben received only made it worse. Anyway, when Scylla made a play for him, Bergen was putty in her hands. He thought she loved him, so he went along with her scheme to get Ben out of the way. So after Scylla got Ben committed and Bergen became CEO, what went wrong? Apparently, Bergen got greedy. He had Ben's title and Ben's wife, and he didn't want to wait to let everyone know it. That caused Scylla a big problem because she knew people would start asking questions if their relationship became known. So she decided to get rid of Bergen and become CEO herself. That way, she figured she could do anything she wanted at the bank. Wait, I thought you told me Bergen's death was ruled a heart attack, Gina objected. Marco was undeterred. It's not surprising that the original autopsy didn't turn up anything suspicious. After all, Bergen was found lying on the floor fully clothed with no observable wounds. When the medical examiner opened him up, his heart showed clear signs of a myocardial infarction. So, case closed. But now the DA has gotten a court order to exhume Bergen's body, and this time they're going to take a hard look at what they can find in his system. There are a lot of drugs that can cause a heart attack. I hear the ME's guess is digitalis. Bergen wasn't in great shape to begin with, so it's not surprising it was fatal. So what did she do? Give Bergen another poison sugar pack? Gina wanted to know. Marco shook his head. Here's the way we think it went down. Bergen drove her to his home the night you overheard the two of them in the parking garage. His wife was out of town, so when they got there they had sex. He probably fell asleep afterwards, and that gave her a chance to give him the lethal injection. By the time he felt the needle, it was too late. Then, once it was over, she managed to get him dressed again and left him lying there. Pretty cold, hun? Gina shuddered. Just then their mother spoke up. She'd been listening to the conversation, and now she said, I'm still confused. Who did Scylla have an affair with, Perry Bergen or Dr. Adenauer? I'd bet money on both of them, Gina said quickly. That woman would do anything to get what she wanted. So what was one more lover to her? Marco shrugged his shoulders. She might have been having an affair with Adenauer, but she's refusing to answer any questions. Adenauer is dead, so we don't know for sure. But even if she didn't, she still had a powerful hold over him. Adenauer desperately needed money to keep his hospital afloat. Scylla found out and offered him a loan in exchange for his help in getting Ben diagnosed as psychotic. Then, when Bergen became a problem, we think she got Adenauer's help with him too. After we get through combing the records at the hospital, I'll bet we'll find that Adenauer was the one who supplied both the LSD for Ben and the digitalis, or whatever she used, to get rid of Bergen when he got in her way, Marco added. Anyway, he went on. Just when she thought she had everything lined up, Bankgroup backed away from the acquisition of CFB because of uncertainty about Ben's status. That was when Scylla decided that she needed Ben out of the picture permanently. By that time, Adenauer was in so deep that he had no choice but to go along with her. Marco gave his mother and sister a wry look. Scylla's little plan was like a cancer. It kept growing and spreading until it got completely out of hand. And even with all that, she might still have pulled off the whole scheme if it wasn't for Gina. Gina blushed and shook her head in denial. That's not true, Mama. Marco figured out what was going on, and then he showed up just in time to save the day. Their mother grabbed both her children and hugged them warmly. All I know is that I'm very proud of both of you, she said proudly. At that moment, their celebration was interrupted by the doorbell. Mama Esposito went to see who was calling and a moment later returned, accompanied by Ben Mitchell. Out of the corner of his eye, Marco noticed that Gina broke into a big smile when she saw who it was. I hope I'm not interrupting, Ben said awkwardly, but this is really the first chance I've had to come by and thank you. He held up a large box filled with calla lilies. "Gina, I don't know how to tell you how much I appreciate what you've done for me, but I figured at least I could start by bringing you these." "They're beautiful, Ben," Gina said, accepting them happily. "Thank you." Ben turned to Marco with a smile. "I owe you a lot too, but I didn't bring you any flowers." "I'm just as glad," Marco said, and the rest of them laughed. Just then Gina's daughter wandered down the stairs. Angela had been playing in her room and had come to see what all the commotion was about. Gina beckoned her over to the group and pointed to Ben. "Say hello to Mr. Mitchell, baby. He's the man I've been telling you about." Solemnly, Angela offered her hand to Ben, who bent down on one knee to shake it. "Are you the one my mama likes so much?" she asked innocently. "Angela?" Gina gasped, blushing in embarrassment. Ben smiled broadly. "I hope I am, Angela." The little girl looked at him appraisingly. "Do you like my mama?" she asked. Gina started to intercede, but Ben held up his hand to stop her. "It's all right," he said. Then he turned back to Angela. With a solemn face but a twinkle in his eye, he said, "You know what? I'm crazy about her." Gina and Ben started dating a few weeks later. Evidences against Scylla piled on and the grand jury found her guilty. It took almost a year to get the sentencing done. It later came out that during the case she started dating a Miami drug lord. She went in his bad side as while dating him, Scylla had sex with another man. The man was never found and Salazar went after Scylla. She somehow managed to escape. It was only after this incident that she decided that she was better in jail than outside. She was sentenced for 25 years in prison. However, she did not stay there for long. It was only after 3 months that she was attacked in the bathroom. When Scylla was confronted by her assassin, she was given a message, "Mr. Salazar sends his love." Scylla died 3 days later. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.